Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this talk by the Wiltshire Museum. My name is David Dawson. I'm the director. So I'm going to be talking about Wiltshire's white horses. And my talk is based on an exhibition we had at the museum a number of years ago, which was put on with lots of help and advice from our long-standing member Brian Edwards, who is a real expert on the topic of white horses. So what you can see on the screen comes from an art project we did at the same time as we had the exhibition. So we have where are we? 8 white horses in Wiltshire. There are, I think, 13 in Britain altogether, including one outlier up in Marlborough that I'm going to talk about. Sorry, in Marlborough, in Berkshire that I'm going to talk about as well. But before that, I just highlight the main source of information, which is this book, White Horses of the West of England by the Reverend Plenderleith. There were 2 editions of this. This is from the second edition in 1883, I think. 1892, that was close. The first edition was 1883. And he gathered together all sorts of stories about the white horses and gave a real account of how and when they were created. But as we see, he was collating information from a variety of sources, not all of which were entirely well known or entirely reliable. The first horse I'm going to talk about has to be the one that is not in Wiltshire, the Uffington white horse. And I think I love this aerial view taken by Bob Clark, one of our members, and you can see the white horse, and just above it the Iron Age hill fort at Uffington. This isn't the archetypal view, though, is perhaps this one, taken by Major George Allen in 1935. This was at a time when aerial archaeology was in its infancy, and people were really starting to look differently at the way that the landscape worked, because you can see things from above that you can't see easily from the ground. And on the ground, you can see the horse with its sinuous shape, sort of striding up towards the white horse. And of course, the great thing about the Uffington white horse is it's the one white horse that we know what its date is. So it's been dated by a technique called optical luminescence, optically stimulated luminescence, OSL dating. And the way that works is that there are grains of silica in the soil, and once those grains are buried, they no longer pick up light from the sun, and you can work out essentially how long those crystals of silica have been buried by the amount of light that's still held within the crystal when it's bombarded with light. Quite weird technique. It's not tremendously accurate. It's not as accurate as radiocarbon dating, but a number of hill figures have now been dated using this technique. So the oldest is by far the Uffington white horse, which we now dates to the around about 800 BC. But I'd say that was within a couple of hundred years. But that puts it quite firmly into the late Bronze Age. The other ones that have been dated more recently include the Long Man of Wilmington, which is early medieval, and the Cernabas Giant, which is now thought to be Saxon in date. But the Uffington white horse is clearly late Bronze Age, and that fits with its location right next to, well, I called it an Iron Age hill fort, but many hill forts go back actually into the late Bronze Age. And one of the reasons for giving this talk tonight is the link to the Eric Ravilious Downland Man exhibition that we've got on at the moment. And this is Eric Ravilious' view of the Uffington white horse. And what's quite striking is that his view, you can't see it you can't see the horse in that way from the ground. the photograph I showed is from more or less the same location. It's not quite, but you can see that the way that Eric has brought the horse down to make it more visible, to make it more striking on the skyline. And Plenderleath was not the first, but certainly highlighted the potential link between the Uffington White Horse and coins of the Iron Age. This is a set of coins of our local tribe, the Durotriges, and they show, as you can see, horses, and you can see the sinuous shape of the back of the horse, but also a variety of others as well, not quite so artistic. And these horses were copies of coins, of Greek coins, and they show the head on one side, head of Apollo, with wearing a laurel wreath, and that's this diagonal here is the laurel wreath, and you can see the eyes and the ear. So rather strange. It's as though Picasso has got hold of it. And here you have the horse with his legs and various other bits and pieces which relate to the design on the Greek coins. But if you go back into the Bronze Age, then there are certain other links between horses and, interestingly, with the sun. And there are a series of horses appear in late Bronze Age and the Iron Age art. So you've got the coins. Here you have the Trundholm chariot, which is late Bronze Age, and you can see here a horse pulling a disc, which clearly has been seen as being relating to the sun. In Silchester, there's a late Iron Age horse brooch found, and here a razor from Denmark. We have to question what this is. Is this a boat with a dragon's head? Is the horse here pulling the sun? It's quite interesting, but there's clearly, but we know from mythology, there is a link between the horse and the sun. And the horse is pulling the sun through the night sky. I think the chariot, the Greek chariot, pulling the sun through the sky. And the suggestion is that the Uffington White Horse was cut perhaps as a symbol, perhaps as of the local tribe, and showing that who was in charge for those people coming up the Vale of the White Horse. The most amazing thing, though, is to remember that any hill figure, anything cut into the chalk, the chalk is going to get vegetation growing on it, soil will start to appear, and over time the horse will disappear unless it's regularly what's called scoured, which means clearing off the vegetation, bringing up new chalk and pounding it into the surface. And what that means is that the Uffington White Horse has been scoured non-stop for nearly 3,000 years, which is just astounding. The scouring has to be done, every 5 years or so, if it's 10 at the most. If it becomes 20 years, then essentially the figure becomes lost. So it just shows how, although we talk about all the changes, we think about all the invasions, during the Iron Age, the Romans, the Saxons, Norman conquest, but the scouring of the horse has continued through all those upheavals for 3,000 years. It's extraordinary. So that's the Uffington White Horse, but sort of puts the Wiltshire ones into context. The earliest one we know of is the one at Westbury, and it was illustrated by a chap called Gough, who was the editing Camden's Britannia in 1772. Now, unfortunately, he got it round the wrong way. This is a wood engraving, and they obviously forgot to reverse it. So it should really be the other way round. And and it's said to have been wrought within the memory of persons now living or but lately dead. So it dates to at least the early part of the 1700s. Now, we have no more knowledge of it than that. And the Westbury White Horse, as you see it today, is actually covered in white concrete. So unfortunately, there's no way of going back and seeing what may have been there and how long that figure could have been around for. The current White Horse, and the concrete follows the same outline, was cut in 1778 by a chap called Mr. G, who was a steward of Lord Abingdon, who owned the estate. And I think he was rather, what's recorded is that he was rather shocked by it. You can see that it was a stallion, and he decided to remodel it to be a more natural horse. Now, the other thing with the need to scour the horse, scour horses and scour hill figures, is that they do change shape over time, because as the grass grows, it may be cut back, but unless there's a very clear edge, then the edges move, erosion will change the shape. And so the shape of these things does change over time. And we can see that in some of the other horses that we're looking at shortly. And so the horse being rather, there we are, rather strange, that may be a purely through historical accident. It might have been quite accurate at one point, but as you can see, it's lost at least one eye, but it does have a saddle, which is quite interesting. Oh, and let alone the fish-shaped tail. So it was recut in 1778, but the situation of it is really quite interesting. This is another aerial view from a microlight by Bob Clark, and you can see the Iron Age, in other words, late Bronze Age hill fort, and a fantastic long barrow just above the setting of the Westbury White Horse. And it is always possible that the Westbury horse could be early. It could even date back to the late Bronze Age in the same way as the Uffington White Horse. But as I say, we'll never know. The next horse where we know the date is the one at Cherrell. And this was cut in 1780, or said to have been cut in 1780 by Dr. Christopher Alsop, who was called the Mad Doctor. I think mad because he wanted to cut the hill figure. And he's said to have stood in the middle of Labour in Vain Hill. That's the on the current A4, which makes its way up the hill. And he's supposed to have shouted instructions, but through a megaphone, to a team of men who planted white flags before the outline of the horse was cut. So that's a distance of nearly a mile. So he obviously had a pretty loud voice or a very effective megaphone. You can imagine him just saying sort of up a bit, down a bit, left a bit, fire. It's a bit like the golden shot, if you remember the TV program. But the obvious question is, why on earth cut a white horse? If it's going to be a tribal badge, that's one reason, but 1780, why? And this is the reason. This is a portrait by George Stubbs of George IV when he was Prince of Wales. And you can see him riding a horse, and you can see the position of the legs is exactly the same as on the Westbury horse. And this is where Brian Edwards comes in. His suggestion is that they're cut as symbols of allegiance to royalty. Remember, this is just after the Glorious Revolution, lots of political upheaval, and it's a way of showing that you're for the king. And of course, remember that the road at Cherrell, the A4, by this time was becoming the main route from London to Bath, or more interestingly for the Cherrell White Horse, Bath to London. So as the king went in his carriage along the road, what would he see but a symbol of his of allegiance to the crown? What could be better? So that probably is the reason why this horse was cut. But again, it's on the location is very interesting. There's some Bronze Age barrows in the hill in the trees here, and you can just see part of the Iron Age hill fort at Albury, which we also know was refortified in the Saxon period. So a real statement of intent. The next horse we can be fairly sure of the date, or there's a date that's been suggested, which is not quite the same thing, is the one at Marlborough. This now is very much hidden away by trees from the A4, but remember that it's on the coaching road. And this is supposed to have been cut by schoolboys from Mr. Gresley's Academy in 1804, and said to have been designed by Master William Canning of the Manor House in Ogbourne, St. George. And he's supposed to have designed it and marked it out on the hillside with pegs. And then the other schoolboys removed the turf and filled the trenches with lumps of chalk. So that's the story. This is the hill. This is the horse from above, and you can see here the way that the trees have grown up and are now hiding the horse from the A4. This photo is taken almost from on above the A4. Now, this is where someone else I'm very indebted to for the story of the horses is Gary Gibbons, who has published a couple of articles in recent copies of our annual magazine, what we call WHAM. This article in 2017, when he was looked in great detail at the Marlborough horse and the way that it evolved. So this is the account of how it was cut. You see, from Plenderleith in 1885, and the pupil said to be, I've forgotten his name now. Where are we? Said to be William Canning, of course, outlined it. And there's also a record. He records that a Mr. Reed essentially rescued the horse from oblivion in 1873. And this is one of the things that Gary has been able to look at in great detail. He went through the archives of Marlborough College and looked for photos that might show the horse. And lo and behold, here it is in 1860. See, there's a cricket match going on, and you can see the horse on the hillside. And you see it enlarged below. And he was able to trace the horse, the shape of the horse, through a whole series of photographs. So top one, 1860, then from top to bottom, 1860, 1866, 1880, 1887, and 1901. And you can see, interestingly, how the shape of the horse has changed and evolved over that time, but also that repairing, as it was put, by Plenderleith of the horse in 1873, clearly didn't do anything. So it was clearly a scouring and was really one of a long line of scourings of the horse. The next horse is that, oh, sorry, and I should say as well, I forgot, there's no record of the reason the horse was cut, but presumably because it was visible from the A4, from the main road to London to Bath, it was must have been inspired by the Cheryl horse, and again would have been a statement of sort of support for the king. You can imagine how that was important in the lessons in the school. The next horse I'm going to talk about is the horse at Alton Barnes, which I have to say I think is my personal favourite. In 1868, the rector of Alton Barnes said that it had been cut in 1812 at the expense of Robert Pyle, who was tenant of the manor farm at Alton Barnes. And he's supposed to have commissioned a painter called John Thorne to design and cut it. And he was paid £20 for doing that in advance. But instead, he arranged for someone else to do it and then disappeared with the money. And then Robert Pyle then decided to finish it off himself. So rather a sorry story. Again, we don't have any record of why it may have been cut. There's stories that it might have been something to do with employment, providing employment for people in the village, but in 1812, that's not very likely. So again, we have to assume that it's part of if you like, the beginning of a craze for doing it, that he'd seen the one at Marlborough and decided that Alton Barnes needed one as well. Now, one of the current the people involved at Manor Farm is very closely linked to the military. And I love this photo, which shows helicopters from the army helicopters flying over the White Horse, because the easy way to get new chalk up to the horse is to invent a training exercise and persuade the army to lift it up in a helicopter. And that's what they've been able to do a few times. And you see the horse here in its glory. The next horse at Hackpen dates to 1838 and is said to have been cut to commemorate the coronation of Queen Victoria, and was created by Henry Eatwell, who was the parish clerk of Broadhinton. And quite an interesting one, this, assisted by a local pub owner. So those of you who know the road between Avebury and Swindon will know there's a pub at Hackpen just below the horse. And I suspect that association was not entirely coincidental, because clearly by that stage, the horses were becoming things to go and see, things to visit. And what could be better than to go and visit a white horse and have a little refreshment while you're there? So good job creation scheme for the pub. And that's it from above. And again, the same features you can see is that the horse is starting to trot or at a gallop, copying that same posture that you saw at Cheryl. And Plenderleith says that in 1864, the next horse at Broadtown was cut by the farmer, Mr. William Simmons. He said that he'd cut it himself and originally intended to enlarge it, but not got round to doing it. However, the story might not be quite as simple as that, because in 1919, a curator at the Imperial War Museum wrote to one of our local papers saying that he'd seen the horse, he'd visited it in 1863, which is the year before it's supposed to have been cut, and had spent the day cleaning and weeding it, and said that according to an elderly relative of his, the horse had been there at least 50 years earlier. So, good question. Did the curator, was he confused? Did he confuse it with the Cheryl horse? Or perhaps Simmons hadn't created the horse at all, but had merely scoured it, or had Plenderleith just got the wrong end of the stick as to what the story of the horse was? So, interesting question. And this is a team of people, villagers from having a go at scouring the horse. And you can see how difficult it is to do. There are various voluntary groups to help keep the horses alive. The one at Cheryl is often done by the local scouts. And you can see on the slope, trying to make sure you can stand upright, doing the weeding, and then spreading fresh chalk is not a simple task. It requires a lot of hard work. Then, much more recent, is the Pusey horse. This was cut in 1937 to commemorate the coronation of King George VI. There had been an earlier horse on the hill, but that had disappeared. And the new horse was designed by a chap called George Marples, who was an authority on hill figures. He'd written a book he wrote a book, or a book was published after his death that he'd started writing in 1949. And he'd developed 3 designs for the new Pusey horse. One showed a horse carrying a boy riding it, because there'd been a story that the old horse had carried a boy. Another horse standing still, but the chosen design was the one trotting left, as the others. And this was cut by volunteers from the Pusey Fire Brigade in 1937. And at the time, the date was placed above the horse, but that's now largely disappeared. And then the most recent horse is 2000, and is at Devizes on on Roundway Hill. This was designed initially by Peter Greed, who had wanted to recreate the horse that had been cut below Oliver's Castle, said to have been cut in 1845. and he'd made a design, but that land wasn't available. The horse was cut to commemorate the millennium in 2000, and the project led by Sarah Padwick. The horse was originally facing left, but they decided to reverse it to face right, because you can now see the Alton Barnes horse and the Devizes horse galloping towards each other to say hello. The site below Oliver's Castle is a triple SI, and with very important rare grassland species, including orchids. So Farmer made this field available, and so the horse was cut there. Now, and we have the original design, was given to us and is now in the museum. So this is the horse that was said was there before. This was said to have been cut by shoemakers' apprentices in 1845. And this is a photo taken in very light snow. And this is where you need a bit of the eye of faith, but you might be able to see there is the head of the horse and its back and its rump. Can you see that? The rest of it has disappeared. So the horse appears, I've seen it in very light frost, and I've seen it in drought conditions, but my photos are not as good as this one. And now again, Gary has come to the rescue of trying to work out what the real story is here. And so he's published this article, The Devizes White Horse, Rethinking Lost Hill Figure, in our latest edition of WHAM. Amazing piece of work, this. He used a drone to do a survey. And here on the left-hand side, you can see the raw data from the survey, and you can see the head and the back and the rump. And you can see here, he's got better eyes than I have. You can see the front leg as well. So he's highlighted the shape of the horse. He has also checked out what the story really is. So Plenderleith said that that it was cut by shoemakers in 1845. This wasn't in his first edition of the book, but actually appears in his own version of the first edition. Sort of was written in by him, and he says that Mr. Barry said that it was under Oliver's Castle, facing towards Devizes. Well, not quite right. Cut in outline only, which makes sense. That sounds right. Cut at Whitsuntide, 1845, very specific, and was known as Snob's horse for years afterwards. Snobs at the time was a nickname, if you like, for shoemakers. Now, when this was published, there was a bit of heated correspondence in the local newspaper, in the Devizes Gazette. And a chap called George Smith said that he remembered it being scoured when he was a boy. And you can see here, I remember well as a boy when at Dr. Big's school, how the doctor took me with all the other boys, removed the turf and scoured the horse, which had become overgrown and neglected. We know how old he was. Well, he says how old he was when this was recorded. And if you go back in time, he would have been a boy, probably at Dr. Biggs's school. The children there were between sort of 10 and 14, and the date goes back to about 1830. And there are two other accounts from Joseph Sloper of the family that ran the department store in Devizes, and Edward Kite, who was a very important member of our society. And they both record how there were attempts to scour the horse in around 1843 that was said to be not successful. So I think what that means is they started but didn't finish. Now, when you put all those together, what you've got is a suggestion that the hill figure was created before 1830, and it was then scoured. Again, attempts to scour it in 1843. That Whitsun date, that could refer to another scouring that was potentially successful. Thurnham, who was superintendent of the Wiltshire Lunatic Asylum. He records seeing it when he came to Devizes, and he arrived in 1849, so it was still visible then. And then it disappeared. It probably had disappeared by the 1870s, so it disappeared later in that period. So that seems to be the period. What that suggests is that it may have been cut during that stage of during the Georgian period, when people wanting to show their patriotism and their allegiance to the king. There are a couple of other horses, a couple of other hill figures as well. One particularly at Rockley, which was seen in 1848, but has now been completely ploughed out. But there's an intriguing one here, which is a hill figure that is at Foxhill on Womburgh. That's the road between Womburgh and Ramsbury. And you might just be able to see in this aerial photo, which was taken in 1846, which shows some markings here. You can see this, and you can see a diagonal line and some lines here. This is taken from a resistivity survey of the hillside, and this is a drawing of what can perhaps be seen in that. It's been said rather unkindly, it looks like someone wearing a nappy going skiing. So this does look a little uncertain, and it's been suggested that this could be a Roman figure, and the link has been made perhaps with the Cernabus giant. But I think this is one of those things a bit like the Westbury White Horse, that we will never know whether this is real or not. There's certainly no account by early antiquarians, so that suggests it was not visible by the 1700s, if it is anything at all. But then, of course, there are many number of other hill figures cut in Wiltshire, not least of which are the Fovan badges, as well as the Bulford Kiwi, cut during the First World War, essentially, mostly during the First World War, essentially as to keep the troops busy and to keep morale up. I'm going to go on and just talk a little about a couple of projects we were involved with around the time of the White Horses exhibition. The first is walking Wiltshire's White Horses, because there is a White Horse Trail linking all of the horses. This had been put together by Wiltshire Council, but sadly the council weren't able to continue imprinting the leaflets, and many of the little way signs had fallen out of use, and as styles had become replaced. So we worked on a project to bring back the route back, and to make it more available. And you can see here we had a whole group of people involved in work in the project, and I love this photo. And no other reason it's a great photo of the Alton Barnes horse. And this project ended up with an exhibition in 2013 at the museum called Freedom on My Doorstep. And we worked with an artist called Ali Pretty, who created some fantastic silk paintings. And what she did was she took each horse in turn and worked with a group to produce initially a silk square, a portrait inspired by each of the horses, and then a silk hanging, a silk banner for each of the horses, created with people from the local community. And for each horse, she developed a circular walk around the horse. This is the opening, this is the unveiling of the artwork for the Alton Barnes White Horse, with Brian Edwards at the front, with a poem as well that she'd written. And then we went on fantastic series of circular walks. And this is the artwork of each of the horses that she created. We then took that one step further. Richard, I've forgotten his name, Richard White, that's right, of Wiltshire College, worked with a group of students from Wiltshire College to create an app. And so we had the exhibition with these hangings, and the app which showed which talked about the story of the White Horses. And then Ali Pretty also did a hanging, which is in the museum, because I'd always wanted something to link between the ground floor and the floor where the offices are at the museum. I felt it really needed something to bring that space, to bring that the stairwell to life. And so she created a poem and a silk banner to celebrate the horses with and a poem. And so, and there were 100 lines of the poem, one for each mile of the walk around the horses. And a small group then walked the 100 miles over in August 2013 and unveiled the flag for each horse as we got to each horse. And finally, the last day was at Roundway. You see each of the banners here, and a band to welcome us. And they then walked into the town during the street festival. And then the banners were almost at the head of the procession. The other thing that had inspired this was that in 2012, we bought this, which will be familiar to those of you who have been to the Ravilious exhibition. And this was a dummy book, as if you like, a sketch of what Eric Ravilious wanted to create as was going to become a Puffin picture book. And we bought this in 2012 for £6,000. And the front cover is fabulous. And this is the reason we had to buy it, because you can see here the Westbury White Horse in the rolling chalk downland that you could see through a train window. And of course, this relates to one of Ravillious's most famous watercolors, Train Window. And you can see here the horse, the rolling downs, the rolling hills, and the train carriage, and the number 3 on it. 3, of course, being for third class. And the thing I love is that you've got the White Horse, the Puffin as logo replacing the third class symbol. Now, something I hadn't realized until I read until it was pointed out to me, that Ravillious's wife, Tirzah Garwood, she records in her autobiography how she rescued, if you like, one of Ravillious's paintings that was destined for this Puffin book. She rescued it by cutting out the Westbury White Horse and putting it onto the downs, because these downs were actually those between Lewes and Eastbourne. So they don't relate to the Westbury White Horse at all. But she spotted that this picture needed just that little bit extra to draw the eye in. And so it's her that placed the Westbury White Horse. So I sort of bought this in some ways for all the wrong reasons, because it's not the Wiltshire landscape, but it is the Westbury White Horse. And if we just take a little look at the sketches inside, we're showing how the book might have worked out if it had ever been completed. And so you see just here some rough sketches, things like barrows, and you can see White Horse, English Hill monuments. That was going to be the title page, but the publisher, Noel Carrington, had decided that it was going to be called Downland Man. And you can see here text, barrows, and so on, and you can see barrows and hill fort sketches here. And he also showed how he was going to how the watercolors that he'd painted in 1939 in preparation for this were going to feature in the book, with text on one side and the images on the right hand side. So you see here his very famous Westbury White Horse. So this is a photograph he had taken of his painting and then pasted in to show how it would work. And this, of course, is his watercolor that is in our exhibition. And lastly, you can't have anything about Wiltshire and without having Silbury Hill. So that shows really how the text was going to work. And also white horses from foreign territory, including the Uffington White Horse and his watercolor of the Osmington White Horse, which is just above Weymouth. This one unusually with a rider, but this was very definitely cut to in celebration of the King George, who regularly came to Weymouth to bathe to take the waters, to swim in the sea. The text was going to be written on books by H.J. Massingham, including one called Downland Man, which talks about the archaeology of the chalkland. He made a real link between the archaeology of Wiltshire and Wessex, the Wessex series of burials of the Bronze Age, and very much he talks about Devizes Museum, as he calls it, and about our collections, and about those links between Egypt and Wessex, really following up on lots of sort of stories and traditions at the time linking the Eastern Mediterranean with Wiltshire. And that's it. That's a brief run through the story of Wiltshire's White Horses, and an encouragement for you to come and visit the Downland Man exhibition if you haven't already seen it. And I'm very happy to try and answer any questions. So thank you. So if you've got any questions, just click on the Q&A button and type them in. I'll just stop sharing, and means I can go to the chat and questions. Oh, David has just said, as a proud resident of Vale of White Horse, he confirmed that the horse is still the official local insignia. Well, very much so. And points out that it's only the Uffington White Horse has only been in Oxfordshire since 1974 in local government reorganisation. Quite so. I grew up in Berkshire, so for me it was the symbol of the county up until 1974, and then I was actually I used to run a museum in Oxfordshire, so I know all about its story. And Tanya has pointed out quite rightly what I was groping for was the Army Air Corps, who were operating the helicopters. So does anyone have any questions? Anything you'd like to add, to say? Any stories of the White Horses? If you've got a story, anything you would like to say, although most of your audio is turned off, I can turn your audio on if there's anything anyone would like to say. So Kath says she remembers seeing near one horse a tiny version of it carved on a stone. Do you know anything of this? I have to say, I don't think I do. I haven't heard of that. Does anyone else, can anyone enlighten us? Sorry, I'm just... No, doesn't sound like it. Steve has asked, do you think there would be many more chalk hill figures cut during the Bronze Age and going onwards? That's a really good question. Not one I thought of. I think the answer presumably has to be yes. Why not? I can't be, if you remember what I said about the way that figures have to be scoured every 10 years or so, otherwise they will just disappear. I can't believe that the Uffington horse is the only one, if it was the only one created in the Bronze Age, the late Bronze Age, it survived, and there can't have been any others. I think there must have been others. And I think that one from Foxham is quite interesting because, it looks rather dodgy, but on the other hand, it would fit, for example, say some of the Saxon ones. And I do wonder, as I say, if the Westbury one is earlier, whether that could be Saxon as well. Oh, and Steve is talking about Gog Magog near Cambridge, which I have to say is one I know nothing about whatsoever. But yes, I suspect if they haven't already, I suspect someone will be forming a project to do OSL dating of the of that figure at some point. People are certainly working their way around them all. Sarah Mike said, is it just horses in Wiltshire pre-20th century, or are other creatures depicted? He knows about the panda near Lovistock. There's the Long Man of Wilmington, of course, is human. There's another horse up north somewhere, cut on ironstone. So I think it is just horses. I can't think of any other. Yes, no, I can't think of any other animals. So I think it is just horses. Remembering that horses have always been prized animals and something to show off. Chris Green says, interesting, consider there must have been one point where the perspective of the horse can be viewed correctly. Anyone said the right viewpoint for any of the horses? That's interesting. That's the work Gary has done. He has established approximately where the horse looks right. And certainly that's the case for Cheryl. If you stand on Labour in Vane Hill in the right place, certainly it looks right. So I don't think anyone's systematically surveyed them, but you can certainly see where it's correct. And Sandy has said the line at Whipsnade. Well, I think that is slightly more recent than, I think that is 20th century. So nice try. Steve has said, have you heard any folklore associated with the eye of the Uffington horse as a chalk circle itself? I haven't. As I say, Steve, if you'd like to tell us that, if you want, I could allow you to tell everyone about that if you wanted. So you obviously know about this. So if you don't mind, I'll turn your audio on. So Steve, you can tell us a bit more about that, because that's something I've not heard of. So you're on mute. So Steve, if you wanted, you could tell us about that. Oh, he doesn't have a microphone. Oh, well, it was worth a try. And Jenna has said the small white horse on the stone is Alton Barnes' white horse, and I think it's in Alton Priors. And I have a feeling that might be Jenna Spillane, who created the exhibition and who I'm indebted to for all the research that she did to make the exhibition work. Diane has said, is there a link to the Gary Gibbons articles I mentioned? They're not online. They're in our annual magazine that you can purchase from the website. Or in a good library. And Steve is typed, it's just a feeling one gets when one stands near the eye, the view as if the horse can see the landscape in front. Well, that's brilliant. Yeah, because the landscape really does open out from where the head of the horse is. So really an interesting perspective. Thank you. And someone has asked, is the chalk available all throughout England or just certain areas? There are bands of chalk. So England, the way geology works in England is that there's lots of strata at an angle where they've been eroded across the top, like that. And so you have a band of chalk running through from Kent and Sussex through into Hampshire and Wiltshire, then ending up in the sea in Dorset, and then also heading up into the Yorkshire Wolds. So it's those areas where you where you find chalk. There's not chalk in the rest of England. And Tessa says you're supposed to make a wish standing in the eye of the Uffington horse. That's not something I've heard of, but sounds like a great idea. The question is, do they come true? And Philip Edwards says that my father always said the Westbury horse was created when King Alfred's horse was killed at the Battle of Edington. Alfred fired an arrow into the air and buried the horse where it landed, and the chalk horse marks the spot. Yeah, a local story. There's no historical evidence for that. But of course, there was a really important, well, absolutely vital battle fought at Edington, between where Alfred defeated the Danes and basically led the ground for the making of England. And Kath says there's a very scary TV series in the 1970s involving the Uffington horse and some power associated with its eye. She can't remember the name, but it got me. Sarah Mike say that we're told by National Trust Guide the eye of the Uffington horse was to do with fertility. That's an interesting one. Can't quite see why, but it's a theory. And Steve has said, could there be a link between the older cut figures and the adjacent hill forts? I think the answer to that is probably yes. As I say, for the Uffington one, the fact those two are very close together is really quite striking. And it would be obvious. Hill forts are not, they're not places where people lived. They're places where you can show that people would have gathered at particular times of the year, essentially Christmas parties. And so it's very clear that those are places where whoever was in charge was able to show off their power and authority. And so what better way of showing that you dominate the whole of the landscape than by cutting a hill figure with your tribal symbol, putting your logo there. It just seems like such an obvious thing to be doing. Kath has said it was the Moon Stallion. She just remembered it and found it on Google. Okay, not one I remember, I'm afraid. Okay, well, I think that looks as though it's all the questions and comments. So I'd like to thank you all for coming, and I hope you've enjoyed the talk, and see you again soon. Thank you very much.